What do you think about Port Arthur now?
Well, it seems to have loosened up a little bit since I left.
Janis Joplin, the wild, untamed queen of rock and blues, was often painted as a soul too raw, too vulnerable, and too explosive for the world she lived in. To millions, she was the symbol of freedom, rebellion, and authenticity, a woman who poured her pain, her joy, and her rage into every note she sang. But behind that raspy, heart-wrenching voice was also a fighter, someone who didn't bite her tongue when she was hurt, disrespected, or dismissed. For decades, fans have only seen the tragic brilliance of Janis, the tortured genius gone too soon at just 27. What they rarely hear about are the feuds, rivalries, and outright hatreds that burned beneath the surface. While many stars of her era played the game of showbiz politics, Janis didn't have the patience for fakery. If she didn't like you, she made sure everyone knew it. Now, through resurfaced interviews, letters, and the testimonies of those who knew her best, a different side of Janis emerges. The one who openly admitted to despising certain singers she felt were phony, privileged, or simply standing in her way. These weren't petty squabbles. To Janis, these rivalries cut deep, shaping her career and her identity in ways fans could never have imagined. So who were the 5 singers that Janis Joplin, the free spirit of the counterculture, admitted she could not stand? And why did these grudges follow her to her grave? Today, we dig into the hidden story of Janis Joplin's most shocking hatreds, and what they reveal about the darker side of one of music's most unforgettable icons. When Janis Joplin first burst onto the scene in the late 1960s, her raspy, gut-punch voice was unlike anything the mainstream had ever heard. But it didn't take long for her to clash with the polished showbiz establishment. And perhaps no singer embodied that slick Las Vegas-style polish more than Tom Jones. Tom Jones was the definition of a showman: tailored suits, choreographed performances, and a powerful voice that thrilled middle America. He was adored by housewives, loved by television producers, and marketed as the safe version of a rock star. To Janis Joplin, this was everything she despised about the music industry. She believed Jones represented the packaged, commercialized side of music, the kind that lacked the grit, honesty, and pain she poured into every song. Their infamous meeting on the set of This Is Tom Jones in 1969 has since become legendary. Producers thought pairing the soulful Joplin with the booming Welsh crooner would create a memorable TV moment. What they didn't expect was the tension that boiled behind the scenes. Joplin felt completely out of place among the flashy staging and over-rehearsed performances. In private, she mocked the artificiality of the show, calling it plastic music for plastic people. Janis's friends later revealed she told them she hated Tom Jones for what he represented. While she didn't deny his vocal talent, she loathed the way he was embraced by the establishment, while raw, unpolished acts like herself had to claw their way into recognition. For Janis, Jones wasn't just a singer. He was a symbol of everything fake in the industry. This bitterness only grew when Janis saw how critics praised her appearance on the show, calling it a refreshing clash of styles. She hated the idea that her authenticity was being turned into a sideshow for network television. To her, Jones was the living embodiment of compromise, a man who played the industry's game and thrived in it, while she was forced to bleed on stage night after night to be heard. Over the years, Janis's anger toward Tom Jones became more philosophical than personal. She used his name as shorthand for the type of performer she despised, plastic singers, as she called them. For Janis, music wasn't about looking sharp or hitting the perfect note. It was about truth. And to her dying day, she never forgave artists like Tom Jones for masking pain with polish. What makes this feud so fascinating is that Tom Jones himself never seemed to understand the depth of Janis's hatred. He spoke warmly about their duet, even praising her talent in later interviews. But for Janis, that night cemented him as the first on her secret list of singers she truly could not stand. If Tom Jones represented everything plastic in mainstream music, Mama Cass Elliot of the Mamas and the Papas represented something more personal, someone inside the counterculture scene who, in Janis Joplin's eyes, had privileges she herself never enjoyed. Cass Elliot was loved in the music world. With her rich voice, magnetic personality, and reputation as the warm, maternal figure of the hippie era, she charmed everyone from industry insiders to fellow musicians. But to Janis, who carried deep insecurities about her own appearance and her place in the music industry, Cass became a figure of jealousy and frustration. Janis struggled her entire life with body image. She had been bullied mercilessly in school, called names like pig and freak, wounds that never healed. Even as a star, she often felt like an outsider among her peers, not glamorous enough, not pretty enough, and too raw for the mainstream. When she saw Cass Elliot, who was also heavyset, embraced so warmly by fans and peers alike, she couldn't help but feel a burning sense of injustice. Close friends have recalled Janis making bitter remarks about Cass, saying she hated how easy it seemed for her. To Janis, it was as if the industry and the public had forgiven Cass for not fitting the mold, while Janis herself remained a target of ridicule. She once told a friend, "Cass gets to be the lovable one. I get to be the ugly one." But beyond appearances, there was also resentment over success. The Mamas and the Papas were a polished, radio-friendly act, beloved for their harmonies and clean West Coast sound. Meanwhile, Janis was fighting to prove that her screaming blues style belonged on the same stage. She despised what she saw as easy listening acts getting recognition for music that, in her eyes, lacked the raw pain and truth she carried in her voice. It's worth noting that Cass herself never spoke badly of Janis. In fact, she admired her, often praising her energy and presence. But Janis could not shake the bitterness. In the smoky haze of the 1960s party scene, she sometimes avoided Cass, once drunkenly snapping, "I can't stand that woman." This rivalry was not born from personal betrayal, as with others on her list. It came from Janis's inner demons, her inability to reconcile her own pain with the acceptance she felt Cass received. In truth, the hatred was less about Mama Cass and more about Janis's own struggles with rejection and identity. Still, to those who knew Janis best, her resentment was real. Mama Cass represented a wound Janis couldn't heal, the feeling of being an outsider, even in a movement that claimed to embrace outsiders. And for that reason, Cass Elliot became the second singer Janis admitted she truly hated. Among Janis Joplin's rivalries, none was more complicated or more volatile than her relationship with Grace Slick, the commanding voice of Jefferson Airplane. On the surface, the two women had much in common. Both were strong, fearless singers at the forefront of the psychedelic rock movement. Both rejected the tidy molds of the music industry, and both stood as icons of female rebellion in a male-dominated world. But beneath the similarities lay a storm of tension, jealousy, and mistrust. Grace Slick had what Janis longed for, a natural aura of elegance, striking beauty, and a kind of cool detachment that drew people in. Where Janis bled on stage with raw pain, Grace projected effortless confidence. For audiences, it made Grace appear untouchable, while Janis often looked vulnerable and chaotic. This difference gnawed at Janis, who confessed to friends that she hated Grace, not just for who she was, but for how easily she seemed to command respect. Their rivalry spilled into their social circles. At the Fillmore backstage parties and Haight-Ashbury gatherings, Janis and Grace often found themselves in the same rooms, and sparks would fly. Friends recall heated exchanges, with Janis accusing Grace of being too cool for her own good, while Grace would shoot back with sarcastic remarks about Janis's drunken antics. What started as professional competition turned personal, fueled by egos and substances in equal measure. Musically, their bands were often compared, and this only deepened Janis's frustration. Jefferson Airplane had hit mainstream success with songs like White Rabbit and Somebody to Love, anthems of the psychedelic era. Meanwhile, Janis was battling critics who often dismissed her blues-rooted style as too messy or too shrill. She hated the way Grace seemed to glide into cultural legend while she had to fight tooth and nail for recognition. The bitterness reached its peak at the Monterey Pop Festival in 1967, the same event that catapulted Janis to fame. While Janis gave a blistering, unforgettable performance with Big Brother and the Holding Company, Jefferson Airplane also dominated the stage. In the haze of applause, Janis couldn't shake the feeling that Grace's sleek delivery was stealing her thunder. Later, she confided to a bandmate, "I can't stand that woman. She thinks she's the queen of this scene." To Grace, however, the rivalry was less personal. She respected Janis's rawness, but often found her exhausting. Slick once remarked that Janis burned too bright for too short a time, a backhanded acknowledgement of her power and self-destruction. While Grace never openly badmouthed Janis, she didn't go out of her way to soothe the tension either. In truth, their hatred was born from a mirror image. Each woman represented what the other could never be. Janis embodied vulnerability and soul that Grace lacked, while Grace carried the beauty and mystique Janis desperately craved. Their feud was less about music than it was about identity, power, and survival in an industry that rarely allowed more than one woman at the top. By the end of Janis's life, those who knew her best said she still carried that burning dislike for Grace Slick. To her, Grace was the rival she could never outrun, the woman who symbolized both everything Janis wanted and everything she despised. And so Grace Slick became the third singer on Janis Joplin's list of those she hated most. If Janis Joplin had a knack for clashing with fellow singers, none of her feuds was as explosive, literally, as the one she shared with Jim Morrison of The Doors. Their infamous encounters in the late 1960s became the stuff of rock and roll legend, and they reveal just how much animosity burned between the two icons. Janis and Morrison were both wild spirits, fueled by alcohol, drugs, and an uncompromising drive to dominate the stage. But while they shared that reckless energy, their personalities collided like fire and gasoline. Morrison, notorious for his arrogance and drunken behavior, often treated women in the industry as conquests rather than equals. Janis despised that. She saw in him not just a rival, but a walking symbol of male privilege in rock music, something she had been battling against her entire career. One of their most famous encounters happened at a party hosted by musician Bob Newworth. Morrison, already heavily intoxicated, repeatedly harassed Janis, pestering her with crude remarks and refusing to leave her alone. After enduring his advances long enough, Janis snapped. She smashed a whiskey bottle over his head, leaving Morrison stunned on the floor. The room erupted, but Janis felt no remorse. As she later told friends, "I hate that man. He thinks he can own every woman in the room." The story circulated quickly in the rock scene, cementing their feud. Morrison, bruised in both ego and body, reportedly laughed it off in public but privately fumed. Janis, however, never wavered in her dislike. She told those close to her that Morrison represented everything toxic about the male-dominated rock culture. A man celebrated for his excesses while women, like her, were punished for the same behavior. Musically, their rivalry also had teeth. Morrison was hailed as a poet, a prophet of the psychedelic generation, while Janis was often written off as a screamer or a wild woman. She hated the double standard. In her view, she poured as much soul into her music as Morrison did into his lyrics. Yet the critical world seemed to give him a pedestal while she fought for respect. Their paths crossed multiple times, usually in chaotic settings of drugs and alcohol, and each meeting only deepened Janis's resentment. Friends recall that she couldn't even hear his name without rolling her eyes or muttering curses. To her, Morrison was not only insufferable personally, but also professionally emblematic of the barriers women faced in rock. What's fascinating is that Morrison, for his part, seemed both fascinated and intimidated by Janis. He admired her power on stage, but couldn't resist trying to provoke her off it. Perhaps in his own twisted way, he respected her strength, but Janis never gave him that courtesy. She loathed him, and she never hid it. By the time of her death in 1970, Janis's hatred for Jim Morrison remained one of her most famous grudges. It wasn't born from petty rivalry, but from a fundamental clash of values and behavior. To Janis, Morrison was a reminder that even in the so-called free love counterculture, the old rules of gender and power still reigned. And for that, he secured a permanent place on her list of the singers she hated most.